Firm and fast seems to be a really hot topic over the past few years. I know specifically within the USGA, our president, Jim Heiler, is really a big proponent of firm and fast, and actually to some extent I think got some unnecessary criticism for some of the comments that he made with respect to brown is the new green. And the backbone with that statement was really it's more about sustainability, and that we don't need our courses to be perfectly lush green, manicured landscapes for them to be an excellent golf course. And so I think those sentiments have been taken a little harshly from some folks, especially in the Northeast, where it's not easy to have poa annua that's brown and it's still alive. If it's poa and it's brown, it's usually dead. So it's been kind of an interesting year, and we've continued to push towards getting the message out that this is really a good thing, I think, for most courses. So what does firm and fast mean? It's really different at each facility. Not everyone is going to have the same perception of firm and fast, and not every course is really built for firm and fast. So we'll get started. Again, it's really going to be different. A course like that's just behind us is probably something that was really built for firm and fast. Other courses may not be fall in that category. So let's take a look at some examples of firm and fast if this works.
And then Dustin Johnson with a 3-iron off the tee at 4.
What is it, 277 to the front edge?
Yeah.
Breeze is helping.
Hello, Dustin. This is going right.
Now, this is hanging right. Well, gets a decent kick. Look at this chasing.
Hanging right on the face. It ricocheted perfectly.
Wow.
Johnson for eagle.
That's a way to jumpstart your round.
Wow.
That gets Dustin Johnson to 3 under par for the championship and just 1 back.
So that was a prime example of firm and fast off of a tee shot. Fairways were rock hard at the Open last year. Approaches were firm. Greens were really firm. It brought in a lot more imagination. And some players were a little bit unhappy that it was too firm, but there was plenty of opportunities to reward a good shot, and this is a prime example.
Go. Oh, go. Could be good. He wants it to
I think it's there.
Yeah.
Watch this spin.
That is unbelievable. I told you you'd hit it close. You just had to wait for 40 guys.
If you guys remember watching that coverage, everyone would land the ball sort of just past the hole location, and it would rocket to the back of the green, and everyone ended up getting pars. And finally, one player, Dustin Johnson, who had a heck of a day. That was Saturday. He didn't fare too well on Sunday, but he hit a great golf shot. Hit just before the hole location, and was able to check up. Really firm conditions, but it was able to be rewarded. So that's the goal there, is to bring more imagination into our golf courses, and with respect to our golf games, there's been some increased interest in that, at least what I've seen in my travels. So we certainly wanted to highlight that. So really, what do we think of when we first hear about firm and fast conditions? I think a lot of people look towards golf courses in the British Isles. You watch a lot of the British Open, or the Open Championship as they call it, on television, and it's often really firm, really brown, and dry conditions. That's where the game originated. It started as a ground game, and it sort of evolved into what we've got as Americanized golf, which is still a really great game, but that's more focused on the air. And a lot of the differences that we have are with respect to our climates and things like that, are the rationale behind, I think, this slow transition over time. So how do you get there? I mean, there's a lot of ways to go about just starting the idea of firm and fast. The first is really to understand your golf course and whether or not it's suited for firm and fast. If you've got an architect, these are the people that are going to really be the ones to help you define the origins of your golf course and how shots were intended to be played around certain holes, things like that. The next is to educate those that are involved, the course decision makers. Everyone in the room should be probably at that table when you're sitting to have the discussion about, do we want to take our golf course to a more firm and fast approach? The bottom line with it, though, we've stressed this at a few other talks, is that nothing happens in agronomy fast, except for crop failure, which is probably something that a lot of superintendents have heard. But it's going to take some time. It's not as easy as turning the water off, especially on the courses that we have out here where I mentioned earlier. Poa annua really is king. It's certainly not something that we want. We know it's not the best species, but it just proliferates so much, and whether we want it there or not, it's pretty tough to get rid of without doing anything major. So it's not as easy as just shutting the water off. Thinking specifically with respect to the U.S. Open, I wanted to touch on a few things, and that was a prime example of firm and fast because, number one, we could control the water. I mean, this is one instance where we really had control over Mother Nature. It was, California in June. It doesn't rain a whole heck of a lot. When we think specifically about our inputs, we had that course pretty much planned from, 4 years up until the event as to this is how we want things to play. June versus July and August are a big factor with respect to plant stress. Anybody go to the U.S. Open this year at Pebble? Must be a lot of people afraid of flying or something. What didn't read very well on TV, and they really never mentioned it, although if you paid attention to what the players were wearing, it rarely got above 65 degrees there. I mean, it was very, very low stress conditions. Poa annua was dominating the greens, but really not a whole lot of stress to them. So that was another aspect of it. When you think of what the greens looked like, HD's kind of an interesting device. I think superintendents don't like it so much if they have televised golf on their course because it really shows the blemishes. And they got some good close-ups of the greens, and they were not the smoothest U.S. Open greens ever, but they were very, very firm. And we got to the point where I wasn't there, but talking with our agronomist that set things up with Mike Davis, they got to the point that said, well, we can fix the smoothness. Just put some water on it. Well, obviously, the downside to that is you lose your firmness. And we chose firmness over the smoothest greens ever for a U.S. Open. I mean, they weren't terrible. And Tiger was very against the conditions of the greens and actually had a conversation. Tiger had a conversation with Mike Davis about it at a different event. And Mike was very keen on saying, you didn't have any problems with him on Saturday, Tiger, when he shot like a 65 or something. So the greens, they didn't look good, but they played reasonably well, especially when we consider the firmness was really right where we wanted it. Another thing that was interesting about that site is there was a ton of different green construction methods there of different ages, and that led to different annual bluegrass biotypes, which just further added fuel to the fire, so to speak, with respect to keeping those greens as smooth as possible. Irrigation was done by hand, and they had about 200 volunteers, and a lot of preparation went into checking moisture with a moisture meter in addition to scouting by hand for months in advance to figure out where their thresholds were, where they could make it through the day, and where they needed to put water on. So that's the U.S. Open. What about on our courses? We're trying to get firm and fast for an entire season. Obviously, we can't get to that same level of firmness, but we can improve our firmness of our golf courses on a daily basis with a lot of things. First of all, you really need to think, from a turf's perspective, if you've been growing in a situation where it's a wet portion of a fairway for years and years and years, the turf is going to grow accustomed to that. Just like a green located in a shaded environment, suddenly you take those trees down to improve the turf health, and that grass almost goes through a shock phase where it's now exposed to full sun when it was adapted to more of a shaded environment. So you really can train the turf, I think. Everything's going to have limits, specifically when you think about pushing for firmness or focusing more on playability. What time of year you're pushing for this. August 1st, trying to get your greens rock hard or the firmest they've been all year probably isn't going to be real easy and probably lead to problems. And then with respect to specific events, how long are you trying to achieve that firmness for? Again, what's reasonable for a week in June is not going to be sustainable throughout the entire year. But bringing things down to sort of a middle ground, so to speak, is really what it's all about. Again, thinking more about the turfgrass plants, putting our minds in that capacity. Our roots are our lifeblood, so to speak. Usually turfgrass 101, when they say, you want to check the health of your plants, where do you look? You look at your roots and your crowns. So those are really important, and we can influence our rooting depths with cutting heights, our fertility. Our soils dictate a lot of this, especially in our fairways if they're really compacted or high clay content soils. If they're constantly wet soils, your roots probably aren't going to be too deep. So that all adds to the challenge as well. Specifically, when we think of the species, we've got a lot of things on our golf course fairways. Greens were probably dominated by annual bullgrass and some creeping bent grass, maybe some velvet. But on fairways, it's usually a hodgepodge, from what I've seen at least. Ryegrass typically is in fairways here or there, whether you like it or not. A lot of times it's moved in, and it's tough to get rid of once it's there. That's going to hold its color a lot longer during a dry down period. Things like tall fescue on bunker banks, that's just naturally a good species under drought because it produces really deep roots. Warm season grasses versus cool season grasses. I know there's some courses that have some bunker banks that are zoysia. Then you got grasses like annual bullgrass that really do dominate our golf courses, despite how much bent grass we think we have out there. We probably have a lot more annual bullgrass, and they're naturally shallow rooted. It's just not a good species to dry down too easily. And that Kentucky bullgrass, that stuff is going to go dormant really quickly, so that's a whole other aspect to think about with respect to your roughs and maybe some tees. So again, picture's worth 1,000 words. Here's a clump of ryegrass. It's okay. I mean, it's holding its own, green color. Again, it's not the best species, but it's something that a lot of golf courses have to deal with. Then you look at the bent grass that's nearby, and it's teetering. It's hanging on. It's probably going to spring back with a nice rainfall, and then everybody's favorite POA. Again, POA doesn't really go brown. It goes dead. So this is a tough scenario, but dry downs are just, it's a real big learning curve to start pushing towards this. Another example of drying things down and improving your firmness course-wide. This just highlights the differences in species. You've got, let's see here, here's fine fescue on this bunker bank, and here's zoysia grass. And fine fescue usually can tolerate some dry conditions pretty easily. Not so much if it gets under traffic, but there's a big difference with the species that are on some of our golf courses. Then you get into, again, this is a Kentucky bluegrass range, and under significant drought, this is going to go dormant really quickly. So everything can be pushed a little bit too far. That's just the turf side of it. What about our soils? That's really what is most challenge, I think, for us to manage, especially on our fairways, because of the acreage that we're having to deal with. Clay soils are, they seem to be pretty challenging. I feel like the north end of the island has got more clay soils, south end maybe more sandy. Either way, if you've got clay soils, it's going to be frustrating. They're going to take a while to dry out after rainfall, but geez, when they get dry, they can be really difficult to re-wet. You can get some shrinking and cracking that goes on. A lot of hydrophobic conditions can develop, which can be really challenging, especially when you're maintaining a really shallow-rooted plant like poa annua on top of heavy clay soils. Then if you have excessive thatch, that's a whole other bag of worms. That's pretty challenging, and most fairways that have a decent amount of creeping bent grass probably have too much thatch. It's difficult to keep at bay unless you're on a really good root zone modification program. So if you've ever been on a visit with either me, Dave, or probably Jim, I'm sure he said the same thing. Thatch functions like a kitchen sponge. So when it gets wet, it stays wet. When it gets dry, you probably see, well, if your wives do the dishes, she's probably seen what a dry sponge looks like. If you've done the dishes, you know what a dry sponge looks like. It's not pretty. So if you got thatch issues, it's going to be that much tougher to dry things out. Here's an interesting example that, actually the first time I saw this was last summer. We had a championship out in the East End, and we really dry things down. This isn't that coarse, but it's the same example. Isolated dry patches they're circular, and they're forming in this particular fairway, and it's a thatch result. It's because of the thatch that's really dried down and almost shrunk a little bit. You'll notice it when you're driving actually on the fairways that you'll use almost like a lot of little speed bumps. And it was really neat to see this. The superintendent wasn't really thrilled with knowing that he was going to have to, intensify his watering afterwards to correct some of these issues. But at the same time, it highlighted there's a deficiency there. There's a little bit too much thatch going on, and if you want to dry things down, you're going to have to work at things to make sure everything's going to stay as healthy and smooth as you want. Another close-up here, just highlighting some of the shrinking and swelling. And then the worst-case scenario when you combine thatch on top of hydrophobic soils. I've seen a lot of golf courses with, particularly in approaches where they don't get a lot of traffic. Maybe they're hand-mown or using Traplex mowers. the thatch goes through the roof, and they've got clay soils. Then you've got a sponge on top of concrete when it dries out, and that's, I mean, your roots don't have much of a chance to go beyond the thatch layer there. So really some challenging soils to work with. Here's an image of the shrinking and swelling that clay soils can do when they're dried too far. So hopefully I haven't discouraged everyone from thinking about firm and fast on their golf course. There's really a lot of pros to doing so. And again, everyone's going to have differing opinions about firm and fast, but these are some that Dave and I agree on. Really, we're returning to the traditions of the game. It was founded in the UK, and that's where the ground game started, and we're bringing that back. And the Northeast is really, really neat. I come from the Midwest, where we don't have a lot of classical old golf courses that were, just really gems of designs built for these kinds of conditions. And you return to these types of routes with your playability, and it really makes for some good golf. Improving the playability, you've got more imagination with your shot making. It's not driver wedge or driver 8-iron. There's a lot more things to think about. So more imagination is key. You bring in bunkers and other hazards more into focus. Prime example there is Marion 2013 Open, where if it plays over 6,900 yards, Mike Davis is probably going to get his tires slashed by some of the members at Marion because they really don't want it to play very long. So hopefully they can dry it out, and they've got all these different fairway contour lines that are going to be challenging off the tee. So it's not going to be just easy to throw a tee shot out there. You're bringing in bunkers and things like that closer and more into play because you've got improved firmness. So again, ideal for older designs, is good for newer designs too, but not every course is going to be perfect for this. It could allow for some adjustments in your putting green mowing intensity. You got more emphasis on firmness, less emphasis on speed. We were talking earlier about a lot of these classical old designs just weren't built for green speeds much past 10. So what's another way to add some teeth into the golf course, improve the firmness of them? That's probably a more appropriate measure. You maintain some of the hole locations and still add more challenge to it, as opposed to just increasing or trying to increase your green speed. And again, that's where that U.S. Open example at Pebble Beach comes into play. And it's probably going to improve the turf health on our putting greens if we take this approach, just with benefits of rooting and things like that. So the classic example, well, it's so easy to do in the British Isles and the UK. Why can't we do it here? And I know most people already know these differences, but I just wanted to still touch on them. Obviously, huge difference in climate. I mean, they just don't get warm. They don't really get terribly cold. They'll get snow every once in a while, but they don't have a summer. It's just kind of constantly a cool fall or a cool spring. They typically have sandy soils on a lot of these courses that are link style in nature. Their soil temperatures, because they're sandy, because they don't get very high air temperatures, they're rarely overly stressful like I showed before. Humidity's not really a problem. Typically have good air movement unless there's some gorse planted directly around the green. Usually not too many trees on a lot of these courses. And all these things are going to greatly reduce their pest and disease pressure. And then perhaps the biggest difference is just the expectations. I mean, I've been to some of these courses in the UK, and you look down the fairways, and I don't know if it'd be acceptable here. Probably not. I mean, the thinness, the sparseness, there's just not a lot of grass. There's English daisy all over the place. I mean, it just, that's acceptable for them. I don't know if it's acceptable for us here. It certainly can be, but that's another advantage that they have. The grasses are different there. Dr. Murphy talked about conio bent grasses, and didn't touch on fescue, but they've got more of those than we do. Both of those produce less thatch, require less maintenance. They're not quite as wear tolerant as creeping bent grass probably, but they don't have carts, so they typically don't have to worry about that too much. They just don't need the same level of inputs that we do to manage diseases and insect pests, things like that. So they've certainly got some advantages. So more about the cons. You've got to be brutally honest when it comes to firm and fast, because there are a lot of pitfalls to trying to adopt such a program. It's some courses, you think of courses on the east end of Long Island, coastal areas where they probably already have some sandier soils, a little bit cooler climates, doesn't get overly humid. They've got a heck of an advantage over courses that are further inland, those that have heavier textured soils. It's just not going to be as easy for everyone to adopt these firm and fast ideals, particularly when the soils are challenging. Going about this avenue is going to put increased pressure on the superintendent and the course officials that decide to make this decision, because there's just going to be more stress likely on the turf. Your irrigation systems really need to be top-notch, I think, in this scenario. If you've got low pumping capacity or poor irrigation distribution, you're going to see those flaws crop up pretty quickly. You need to increase your labor for hand watering. Think about, you're probably already doing a lot of it on greens. If you're not, you absolutely need to. And then maybe even start to branch that off a little bit on approaches, or a little bit here or there on fairways. Certainly not full scale, but it's got to be more of a dialed-in irrigation program. And so that's going to be increased pressure on the staff. Again, the turf challenges I kind of touched on, but traffic under drought stress turf, I touched on it with my earlier presentation. I'll show the same thing, but there's some other issues that can really crop up quickly. Not so much on greens necessarily, but on fairways. Because of the acreage that we're dealing with, it just puts everything else that much more at risk, especially because we're managing poa annua in a lot of cases. So if you do lose grass, you're going to have issues with weed encroachment, bare soils, probably more poa annua germinating in there. It can become a vicious cycle. So you've got to do your homework with this. But another example, again, drought stress turf under traffic. Things pushed a little bit too far and heavy traffic, and you're going to pay the price. So bottom line, some species are just not going to handle it. If you've got weak POA just year in and year out, you're constantly losing grass on certain areas of high traffic fairways, things like that, it's just going to struggle that much more if you just suddenly turn the water off. So you may need to think about regrassing. You can try to retrain the grass, but a best case scenario, you probably get a newer bentgrass variety out there and be able to start from scratch with that respect. Many courses, just about everyone's probably going to have to, unless you've already been on a really good thatch control program, probably have to increase your verticutting or aeration a little bit more just to take care of any thatch that might be there already. And again, the regrassing is somewhat common. The further south you go, it's a tougher sell on the north, but there's some huge benefits to it. And Dr. Murphy touched on some of the disease resistance that's out there. Really, really big savings. And you think about from an environmental standpoint, the pressure that's going to be placed on us over the next 10 or 15 years is certainly going to get a little bit more intense. What better way to manage your fairways by taking out a substantial amount of fungicide inputs and increasing them in cultural practices like fairway top dressing, fairway verticutting, and aeration. It doesn't mean you're never going to have disease, but you can really scale things back to a great degree with some newer, improved grasses. But again, you got to manage the thatch. If thatch gets too out of control with some of these newer grasses, it can get hydrophobic and be really difficult to keep alive too. On greens, fairy ring, we start drying things down. We might see some of this crop up here or there. Usually not too concerning until you really start drying the turf out, and that's when fairy ring and other problems can really be severe. And again, it's green. It's 3-4 acres. We're maintaining it pretty intensively already. We can usually keep fairy ring at bay with wetting agents and fungicides. But throw that on your fairways, and that's 30 acres, and it's tough to be able to hand water these areas to prevent them to go hydrophobic. Then when they do get to this point, you typically have to manage these areas with a wetting agent, maybe a fungicide if the disease is still active. So these problems can quickly arise if you're not on your toes. So what can we do? First off, retraining the golfers is the most important aspect of it, getting folks to understand why you're going to be making this shift towards a little bit more emphasis on firmness, and then go from there with retraining the grass. So communication is key, not only between the course officials and the golfers, but between the superintendent and the course officials. Maintenance guidelines, Jim touched on it a little bit earlier, are really, really helpful because it just gives you an understanding of what side to err on, how far to push things. If you end up losing grass and you feel like, okay, well, I gave you firm and fast, this is what you were asking for, and then you suddenly find out, well, we wanted firm and fast, but we're intolerant of losing a blade of grass. You guys are on a very different page, so you've got to keep those communication lines open. Okay, so starting with the soil, again, controlling thatch is huge. Improving the soils that you may be growing on. If you may not have thatch, but just heavy textured clay soils that might not drain well, you need to think about improving those with cultivation and top dressing. Fairway top dressing has been really successful as a long-term program at many golf courses that I visit. It's not cheap, especially when you think of the initial price of a fairway top dresser is 25 to 40 grand, and then buying the sand each year plus labor and time to do it could add up to 20 to 40 grand just with that program. But there's a lot of benefits to it. Firm and Fast is certainly not the only one. Doing more compaction or alleviating compaction more often with vertidrains and cultivation at the surface also add up, but there's a huge amount of benefits to the turf, not just the playability here. So what else? Improving drainage, cutting in drainage trenches here or there is always helpful, but really understanding your irrigation coverage, I sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, that's really important. Dialing in your uniformity and knowing exactly what kind of conditions are going to be necessary for your turf to survive throughout the day and throughout the week under a dry down is important. That's where things like moisture meters have really made a lot of headway. You can get the portable ones or in-ground ones. These things are really neat. You can go large scale and really map out your wet spots and your dry spots with some of these newer technologies to help with precision turfgrass management, to know exactly where your wet spots are, where your dry spots are, and dial in your uniformity as best you can. So this is some neat new technology that some of you may have already looked at it, but you can just really pinpoint where certain areas are behaving differently than one another and adjust your management from there. So from the turf standpoint, again, retraining the turf is great. Pole annua is not going to ever become this drought-hardy turf grass. So regrassing is probably the best course scenario. You can try to encourage your species there, that's creeping bentgrass, through growth regulators. That's a long-term program as well. And a lot of times those bentgrasses that are on your golf course are just not very good bentgrasses. So you're going through all this pain and effort to slowly convert your fairways to higher populations of bentgrass. Maybe it'd be easier just to one quick swoop, just regrass everything and quickly turn the page. Then again, when it comes to being able to understand Mother Nature and where to err on with respect to your watering, that's also pretty important. And you've got to use as much hose as you can. That's going to be strikingly different for each golf course. I don't think this is something that's going to be too possible for many golf courses, but the more hand watering you can do, the more uniform you can be able to apply it. So that's always important. And at the end of the day, just really realizing that there's just some holes that are never going to play the way everyone wants them to play. Firm conditions are great. It usually offers, like I said, more imagination with bump and run shots, but this is a classic example of a green that is just never going to be too conducive to a bump and run shot because of the false front. The approach is dipped down a little bit. I mean, the approach can be rock hard, and it's probably not going to bounce up. So understanding that there's some limitations with this concept of firm and fast is really important. So wrapping up, firm and fast, I think it's definitely got some potential to save money in some areas of the U.S. In the Northeast, if you're growing a ton of pole annua on your fairways, it's going to be a little bit more challenging. But it depends on how far you can take things. If you can really dry things out and you've got a little bit more leeway to lose a little bit of grass here or there in your fairways because you're pursuing these types of conditions, it's got more benefits for you. So again, it can't be achieved overnight. This is a long-term goal to improve your firmness on your golf course. And it's not something that just you dive into. It needs to be a really thoroughly discussed option in planning for this type of goal long term. Again, we can really teach turf to grow in a lot of different ways, and it's just a matter of making sure everyone's on board when we start this process. So again, personally, firm and fast conditions I think are the best for the game. It may be best for your course. This is my opinion. It's certainly not my golf course. It's for the superintendents. It's not yours either. So what's right for one isn't necessarily right for the other. You got to sit down and ask the question: is this worth it? Is the playability, the benefits in playability and probably plant health, are they worth the extra money, the extra time that we may need for a few years to improve our system to get to this firm and fast approach? And again, that's certainly not for me to say. I've got my opinions, but those are always going to be a little bit different from everyone else. So to wrap things up, again, game is played on grass, just sort of come full circle. Let's just think to the basics. Firmer conditions and healthier grass are, in most cases, best for golf, but that's, you guys are the ones that make that ultimate decision at your golf course, but that'd be my opinion. Typically, I think firmer, drier golf courses are probably a little bit more sustainable, but in the land of Poanya, that's a little bit more challenging to say. But the bottom line here is that having a lush green golf course that's perfectly manicured doesn't any way translate into good playability or making it a great golf course. So understanding the pros and cons with this type of approach are really important with pursuing this type of playability for your golf course. And I think everyone's on the same page with knowing that it's not easy. It's not as easy as just turning the irrigation system down or throttling it down for an extended period of time.